Chapter 8. A Secret. The boiling inside him threatened to spill over, so close that he could feel his eyes heating. An overwhelming urge to wipe out this woman with his power came over him, but he tortuously kept it down. He was sure that something dark flashed in his eyes for a moment, yet unsure if it was obvious to her. But she showed no recognition or surprise. He simmered enough to allow himself to speak.
"This is an unacceptable ask,"
he said, quieting the rage inside.
"What happens to you must prioritize your traditions. The Gerudo will never be ruled by anyone other than their own rightful king."
Lady Impa narrowed her eyes slightly. "Have you met King Rauru, Prince Ganondorf?" Ganondorf shook his head in disgust. It was the last thing he wanted. Once he met the king, he'd have to kill the king. The act would be inevitable, but the thought of it now proved overwhelming. "I suggest you give it a try. King Rauru is one of the most empathetic beings I've met, and I've lived a long time. Our people have our own traditions, of which the king has graciously approved. If you were to speak with him, I'm sure he would come to a compromise as to the future leadership of your city. He only wants peace." Peace indeed. What peace could be had with another in power over the Gerudo? Compromise or not, after centuries, if not more, of tradition, it was impossible. That very king's army had been trying to kill him for years. Peace.
"My people desire to follow their own traditional trajectory. A Hyrulean overlord would go against their very nature."
If being ruled is such a terrible thing for the Gerudo, then why do they want a king at all? She asked, her curiosity genuinely piqued.
"If you know the history of my people, my lady, then you know who I am. You know how many male Gerudo are born in a century. You know how much that means to them."
Fury grew in his chest again. How dare she question his people? She should worry about her own, especially if she enraged him enough. "I see," she replied, a certain disappointment evident in her voice. "Then I am afraid we are at an impasse. I cannot provide your victuals if you refuse to even consider my request. Do travel home safely." She smiled pleasantly at him, infuriating him more. Is this what it would come down to? He'd truly have to take it by force, destroy this woman's peaceful town and perhaps even the people themselves. She didn't know what she was risking. But the longer the seconds drew by, the less he cared. His power was overcoming him, his moral compass, his conscience. They flickered like dwindling candlelight.
"I highly suggest you change your mind,"
he told her, his body trembling with fury. There was no way she didn't see it now. A faint red mist began to emanate from him as he slowly stood. She raised an eyebrow, and the door behind him burst open. The same guards he met before stood at the entrance, gripping... Ganondorf didn't know what exactly. Weapons, seemingly, but they seemed to glow with a ghostly blue pattern. Projections, not steel. If he reached out and touched it, he didn't know if he'd feel anything, or if his fingers would be severed. The technology of which people spoke belonging to the Sheikah, he must be witnessing its power this very instant. The uncertainty of it settled him, dissipated the mist. He did not know how powerful these weapons were, did not know if his own power could destroy them or even make a mark. And he did not want to risk it to find out. "Prince Ganondorf," Lady Impa said, still kneeling on her cushion, unfazed. He turned back to her, seething. I highly suggest you change your mind. The guards began to crowd him out of the building, their glowing blue weapons humming through the air. Whether it was magic or otherwise, he did not know, and he felt real fear for the first time in a long time. They successfully pushed him out and down the stairwell, and his people stared at him, shuffling in unease. It was demoralizing, being herded by these men he didn't know in full view of the people who followed him. They stopped before the group of Gerudo, and one of the men spoke again. Leave Kakariko, and do not return. Ganondorf narrowed his eyes in response. They dropped his own weapons at his feet. Unless you decide to heed Lady Impa's demands. It took everything in him not to rip these men apart, but he retrieved his weapons, stiffened his body, and turned, raising a fist to signal to his people that they were leaving. He heard them murmuring behind him as he walked forward, a leader, a named king. Adeira's taunting echoed in his mind. He resisted the urge to gaze down at his hands to see them shaking. A king's hands should never shake. They made camp just outside of the village. Ganondorf's mind reeled as he tried to strategize to determine how he could overcome the insufferable demands of Lady Impa, a woman who so obviously did not respect other cultures. She had teased him with an offer of help while assuming he would bend the knee to the usurper. She would regret that. Jerusa arrived unbidden to his mind as he sat by a fire in the dead of night. Sleep would not come, not until he knew what to do. He wondered what she would advise. Over the years, Jerusa had grown in intelligence, proving her worth to the elders who took her on as an apprentice of sorts. She seemed perfect to him, the best fighter, the smartest student, the most beautiful Gerudo. Their friendship had shifted into something else, and there was nothing he could do to brace against it. Had this not been the case, he would have taken her on as an advisor once he was crowned. But now there was too much uncertainty. He pondered that she might tell him to leave, just take the loss and figure out another solution. Don't let his anger take over. But how was he to allow other people in power the leniency to make demands? How was he to be merciful when he was supposed to be the most powerful and dangerous man in the world? He could not avoid his destiny, and war was part of that destiny. The stars twinkled above him, bright and numerous. The moon was hidden tonight, allowing the darkness to contrast against the light they emitted. He'd always found the moon intriguing. It had power itself, pulling on the oceans, deciding when and if one could see every star, and there was nothing anyone could do to change it or stop it from doing its duty. He would have to be as powerful as the moon, and one day he would be. Perhaps this decision he had to make would determine whether he was up to the challenge. The grass to his right crunched, and he looked up from his rumination to see a figure standing there, lit by the firelight. Not a Gerudo, his people were sleeping away the night a few yards away. A Sheikah. Ganondorf stood and drew his club from his back. The Sheikah man's eyes were wide, but not in fear. He seemed odd.
Who are you?
Ganondorf asked, his voice gruff and tired. He was done with these people. Would he have to kill this man to let them know? My name is Dormo, the man said. His voice shook with an emotion Ganondorf couldn't quite place. Excitement? Ganondorf took 2 steps toward him, and the man cowered a bit.
And what is it you want?
He kept moving forward, forcing the man to step back until he was flat against the hillside behind him. Then the man did an unexpected thing. He knelt. Head bowed, hands to the ground, a full submission. Ganondorf frowned, wondering if this was some kind of trap, a ruse to get him to feel at ease. "Your Majesty," the man said into the dirt, "I am here to serve you." A Sheikah man serving the Gerudo King? The preposterousness of the idea almost made Ganondorf laugh. Something wasn't right here. He would figure out what it was, however he had to. Rise. He wanted to gain this man's full trust first. He did as instructed and gazed into Ganondorf's eyes with the same strange admiration. It seemed genuine, but he wasn't certain he could trust it. Your Sheikah, why would you serve me? Considering your lady's opinion of me, I'd think you'd want nothing to do with my rule. My king, you have supporters in places other than your own home. It may surprise you to know it, but it's true. Explain. I am part of a secret faction of Sheikah who support your claim to the throne. Your Grace, we've heard tell of your awe-inspiring red power. The man opened the front of his white robe to reveal a hidden, blood-red sash wrapped diagonally across his torso. We believe you have the rightful claim and the ability to lead. Rauru is an unfit leader, a man unwilling to do what is necessary. He is an imposter from the sky, and his race is dwindling. Dwindling? Ganondorf thought of the mysterious Zonai and their unexpected appearance in this land years ago. The people then thought them gods. Some still did. But according to Ganondorf's studies, Rauru was just another vulnerable being who could be killed, just like any other mortal. But again, how could he trust a Sheikah? There was only one way to find out. If the foolish man still pledged loyalty afterward, Ganondorf knew he could take his word for truth. Without a second thought, he raised a hand and aimed his power at the man. It slammed into him, wrapping itself around a leg. The Sheikah screamed. A familiar sound. A welcome sound. Ganondorf stepped towards him, letting the red tendrils squeeze and devour. But not completely. He'd be injured for certain, but not dead. Not yet. He strode right up to the Sheikah's contorted face. This is that power you are so fond of. What do you think? He said nothing, but his screams died down, and he stared wide-eyed, his pupils contracting with a stubborn determination. Nothing to say? Admit your lies now, or there will be consequences. He remained silent, grunting in pain, but withstanding the agony fairly well, considering. Finally, Ganondorf felt satisfied. He withdrew the power and let the man fall to the ground in a heap. His trousers were half eaten away, and the skin underneath chewed into a pulpy wound that Ganondorf was unsure would heal. He'd never allowed anyone to live after using his power on them, after all. He knelt down to the man's level. Do you still serve me? The man hesitated only for a moment. You are my king. Chapter 9. Home. The journey home would take longer due to the extra load. Wagons upon wagons filled to the brim with supplies were dragged behind horses provided to Ganondorf and his fellow Gerudo by the secret Sheikah group. Dormo, limping happily, had introduced Ganondorf to some of them. 5 other men, 2 women, and even one 12-year-old boy. They all came together to gather the supplies in secret and presented them to him as a gift. It pleased him to know that this group existed. He left the outskirts of Kakariko with a greater vision of the future because of it. They seemed to love him, truly love him. How this came to be, he still was unsure, but Dormo had explained that some Sheikah found King Rauru to be a conqueror who only cared for the few and not the masses. Apparently, there had been a skirmish with monsters within the village a year or so ago. The Sheikah had sent for help from King Rauru's forces with no response at all. They had felt abandoned by their ruler, while Lady Impa sat back and watched it happen, defending the absent king all the while. Dormo had been adamant that once they heard about Ganondorf, his power and his prophesied rise to kingship, they felt a pull to back him, denouncing the usurper king, a foreigner, a stranger. Ganondorf had asked why Rauru's kind was dwindling, as Dormo had claimed, and was told that secret intel revealed the Zonai were only so many strong. Most had actually gone back home, into the sky, to whatever unknown place they used to reside. Currently, there were very few Zonai on the surface, including King Rauru himself and, notably, his sister Minoru. They both were holed up in their castle on a raised plot of land called the Great Plateau. They had built an empire there and a temple of some kind. Ganondorf knew of the plateau, as part of Gerudo Canyon passed near it, and so had his company on their way to Kakariko. It was a well-known landmark. The Zonai usurper had accomplished so much in so little time. Ganondorf knew that his own takeover would be difficult, as he was at a disadvantage. But now he knew much more than he used to. He would use this knowledge as a weapon. Every last word of it. The Sheikah group blended back into their village once Ganondorf and his people left. They swore allegiance to him, and that they would continue to work against King Rauru in any way they could, promising to send word of more intel the moment they received it. Ganondorf told them to disguise themselves as Hylians if any of them were to travel the desert, as a Sheikah in the area would arouse suspicion. With this new plan in play, he felt more secure in his conquest. He would be crowned in a few days' time, and everything would fall into place. One measured move by one. They trudged through the sand with scarves about their faces, squinting their eyes against the raging sand shroud that still pervaded the desert. Ganondorf had half hoped that the storm would have abated by the time they returned, but it persisted. Regardless, the wagons were protected with tarps, and their supplies remained undamaged as they entered, relieved, into their home once again. Their fellow Gerudo welcomed them back earnestly, gazing wide-eyed at the wagons and stealing peeks inside, their murmuring growing into excited cheers. They finally had help, and Ganondorf allowed himself to smile genuinely for the first time in a long while. He helped his people unload the wagons, tossing fruit to the nearby domesticated sand seals who gobbled them up in seconds. The Gerudo weren't the only ones who had gone hungry. People laughed and chattered, communing with one another and hugging. It was joyous, intoxicating. He swelled with pride at the knowledge that he had accomplished all of this. He looked around for Jarusa's face, but didn't see her. His mothers were among the happy onlookers, so he stepped over to them, his head held high. "Ganondorf, I'm so very proud of you," Kotake said, taking him in her arms. "Your coronation will be grander than we planned with all of this to sustain us." Koume simply grasped his arm. "Yes, you were smart to seek assistance." Ganondorf raised his eyebrow at her willingness to admit he'd been right. "How did it go?" He opened his mouth to explain, but a sharp voice cutting through the din of the city center stopped him. "Ganondorf, king!" He knew the voice. Adeira. He turned and tensed as he realized what she had done. "Jerusa," he whispered, his voice trembling. Adeira had Jerusa in a chokehold, with a scimitar to her throat, her eyes fiery and challenging. Chapter 10: A Vendetta. The first time Ganondorf had seen anyone executed was when Adeira's mother was hanged in the city center 8 years ago. It had only taken a couple of weeks for Koume's investigation into Adeira's alleged betrayal of the crown to conclude. It had been found that Adeira's mother was the true traitor. She had hired a bounty hunter, the Hylian Ganondorf had obliterated with his newfound power. Ganondorf was incredulous, knowing that Adeira had to be the true offender, that it didn't make any sense otherwise. Perhaps her family also believed the same vitriol that Adeira did, but Adeira was the perpetrator. She had to be. But Koume insisted that her mother did all of the heavy lifting and was to blame for everything. So the entire city gathered in the square to watch the traitor die. The poor woman's tongue had been cut from her mouth so she couldn't spew lies in her moments before death. Adeira was forced to watch as well, and screamed the entire time, held back by guards lest she attempt to somehow rescue her mother from her terrible fate. Ganondorf, still a 10-year-old boy, his power newly discovered, almost couldn't handle it. Koume forced him to stay, held his shoulders firmly, and told him to keep his eyes open, to watch justice do its work. She insisted that it was necessary. But as the woman swung from the rope, her neck echoing an audible snap throughout the square, Adeira let out a wail that creeped into his spine and seemed to crack his skull, a sound he'd never forget. And now, as Jerusa's fearful yet determined eyes pierced him, he felt something similar writhing in the back of his own throat, ready to be let loose. Her bravery was evident even now as the blade at her throat cut into her just a little.
"Unhand her now, Adeira. You will regret this decision for the rest of your very short life if you do not,"
Ganondorf said, red mist billowing around him. He left his power mostly unguarded now, and it seethed, waiting for its chance. But he couldn't let it go until he had a proper target, and right now Adeira was using Jerusa as a shield. And she knew it. "You're the king? Go ahead. Kill me like you killed my mother, and watch as your girlfriend dies right along with me," she said to him, her voice full of hatred and angst. "Adeira," Kotake started, tearful, but she was cut off. "Shut up! This is between me and your precious prophesied son." Her lips curled into a wild sneer. "Besides, I have a secret to tell."
"Jerusa,"
Ganondorf said, ignoring Adeira, trying to communicate to his friend with few words that she'd be alright, that he'd never let her be hurt. Jerusa grimaced and shut her eyes, a desperation beginning to break through her courageous facade. She struggled slightly, but had to still when Adeira's blade drew blood. "Do you want to know my secret?" Adeira yelled, sounding more and more unhinged. Ganondorf watched as 2 guards crept up behind her, their spears drawn. They'd impale her and she'd never cause problems again. Jerusa would be safe. He just needed to keep Adeira distracted.
"I don't need anything from you," he retorted. "Your mother was a traitor. She ordered my death, betrayed her people, the very people who fought for her right to live free every single day."
A sour laugh burst from Adeira's throat. "Live free? You think just because we aren't ruled by the King of Hyrule that we're free? Your very existence ensures that we aren't. You are more of an imposter than that Zonai scum." The red tendrils slithered higher into the air, searching for a meal. They were frantic, but he kept them in check. The guards were closer now, just a few more feet, and they'd free Jerusa.
"You can think what you will, it doesn't matter. You're in the minority, Adeira. You'll never get the support you want, and you've now made this decision very easy for me."
He stepped closer to her, closing the distance between them so his power wouldn't have to travel as far, once he could safely release it. "What decision?"
"Whether to keep you alive."
Seconds until the guards reached her. "But my secret, Ganondorf, you'll want to know. It has to do with your beloved mother, after all. How she betrayed you." Liar. She was trying to get a rise out of him, trying to get him to lose control so that he'd hurt Jerusa in the fray. "She did nothing wrong, you know," she continued. "My mother, she hated you, wanted you dead, yes, as did I, but she never lifted a finger against you." Ganondorf inhaled sharply as she turned her head just enough to notice the guards. She backed further away from them. They kept their spears raised, but now they couldn't touch her.
"If you free her now, I won't kill you,"
he replied, his anxiety getting the best of him. His power pulsed along with his heartbeat. "But I can't leave without accomplishing my mission," she continued. "Ask her. Ask Koumei when the Hyrulean army stopped trying to kill you." She grinned. "And when she tells you, remember that I was the one who did this to you. Her betrayal will pale in comparison." Calm seemed to take over her face, her body shifting from rigid to relaxed. She looked into his eyes and said, "I'm going to put a smile in her throat." Jerusa's eyes widened. "Gan!" And before anyone could act, Adeira sliced Jerusa's throat open, allowing her body to fall limp to the ground. Red, it was all he could see, all he could feel. The sky burned red. His eyes burned red. The moon burned red. He didn't believe it had happened, and yet his power, uncontrolled wild, was doing its worst, consuming Adeira, every last bit of her, and disintegrating her into nothing. Red. She didn't even scream.